Bethany McLean is a journalist and contributing editor at Vanity Fair. She's the author of The Big Fail. Bethany, I've been a fan of your work for a very long time, and I'm so glad that you and Joe took a deep dive here. Many of us still looking to move on from COVID, but so many important lessons.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for your kind words.
So you end the book with the Churchill quote: "Those that fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." How much self-reflection, as you went into writing this, researching this, how much self-reflection is actually going on? Because it feels like a lot of selective history, depending on where you stand politically on masking, lockdowns, not lockdowns, vaccines. People have sort of drawn lines in the sand. And so is there any sort of assessment, even within industries right now, about what took place over those years?
I don't think so. And I've become increasingly cynical about the idea that we're going to learn any lessons. I remember back in the days of Enron, I thought we'd all learn the lesson about how bad short-termism was. And after the financial crisis, I thought we'd learn the lesson about having a stable structure for housing finance. And after this, I thought we'd learn some lessons from the pandemic. And I think our collective memories just get shorter and shorter. And I think you can see the unwillingness to look back and precisely the things you mentioned. If you were pro-masking during the pandemic, you're still pro-masking. If you were pro lockdowns, you're still pro lockdowns, and those things are identified with your political party, which to me is one of the most ridiculous things that we've come out of the pandemic with. Why should your views on how to handle a pandemic have anything to do with your political affiliation? And yet they've become a form of virtue signaling. Maybe it's pandemic signaling, pandemic virtue, something. Anyway, but I don't think very many people are willing to question what their beliefs were in the pandemic. I think we're more divided than we ever were.
Yeah, and when we talk about we, it seems like the U.S. is unique in this scenario, but to what extent do you get the sense that other countries went through this the same way, or was America unique, and why did everything become so politicized in this country, whereas other countries seem to be able to manage things in a more unanimous way?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question. What came first, the politicization heading into the pandemic, or what we got out of it? Because I think you see in other countries where there was some of that going on, like the UK, there's more division, and in countries where there wasn't that divide beforehand, there's less of a divide now. Obviously, here it revolves around the hatred of Donald Trump. So everything Trump said, even if it might have been right, became wrong, just as a reflexive reaction to who he is. And so I think that's one thing that made it way worse here. I do think, though, that there's another important way that the U.S. stands out, which is that measured over excess deaths during the pandemic, our numbers are worse than other developed countries. But if you contrast that to our spending on healthcare, where the U.S. spends as a percentage of GDP on healthcare, I think twice that of any other developed nation, then you think, wait. What is all the spending on healthcare getting us if we can be hit by a pandemic and have worse outcomes than everybody else? Because what that means is that we were a less healthy population going in. So it really also, to me, showcases the failure of our healthcare system. And I think that's almost second in line behind how divided our society is how screwed up our healthcare system is, because that really has the potential to mess up our future as a country.
Yeah, you spent some time diving into that in the book, sort of how we got here pre-pandemic, and then, of course, the impact of the pandemic. But the statistic you laid out is remarkable. I just want to repeat it. We spent twice as much as everybody else, and yet got hit harder than many developed countries when it comes to the pandemic.
And that's stunning. And there were even statistics that are in the book that we spent twice as much on hospitalized COVID patients as other countries did. So wait, what is this? And our inefficient healthcare system is obviously, it's a human rights issue, but it's also an economic issue for this country, as healthcare consumes a bigger and bigger portion of our budget. And when I say human rights condition, there's a quote that I keep coming back to that was what Lyndon Johnson said when he signed signed Medicare and Medicaid into existence, is that without the health of our people, all of our dreams are dead. Basically, we can't hope to accomplish anything if we don't have a healthy populace, and it's true. And I think where we once all might have believed, well, you're on your own for healthcare. Whatever happens to you doesn't really matter to me. We see in the pandemic, actually, yeah, it does. What happens to you does matter to me. And so we are all in this together, from the people who can't afford healthcare to the people who never think they have to worry about it.
So you lay out what has taken place in the healthcare industry, the hospital industry, even going back to when there wasn't a hospital industry not so long ago. Set the table here. How did we get to where, to modern times, the for-profit industry, and what did that mean for the response to COVID, and then what's left of it post-COVID?
So I think we have this very weird mixture in America. We don't really have a healthcare system. We have a healthcare mess. We have healthcare chaos. And part of that is because we haven't decided. We have this rabid belief in the free market that makes us not question, or makes at least some people not question, when the rules under which the free market is set up are not giving us the outcomes we want, or are not. And so if you look at the hospital system, if the hospitals that won profit-wise were the ones that delivered the best care at the lowest prices, okay, we might say we don't want a capitalist system in our healthcare market, but at least that's a functioning capitalist system. We don't have that. The hospitals that win are not the ones that deliver the best prices, the best care at the lowest prices. They're the ones that figure out how to gouge the payers the best, and how to operate in the most profitable markets, and how to slough off unprofitable patients onto everybody else. So you had this issue heading into the pandemic, where you have places in the country that are effectively healthcare deserts, and of course the population there is a lot less healthier. And
when you say healthcare desert, define that.
I mean just very little access to healthcare within a pretty broad range. So if you looked at, for example, just to take Manhattan, and I'm going to get the numbers a little bit wrong, but there were something like 6 or 7 beds per 1,000 residents in Manhattan heading into the pandemic. If you went to Queens and the Bronx, there was 1 bed. So you could see that wealthy areas had a lot more access to healthcare than that's just one way of measuring it, than less well-off communities. And so the pandemic comes along, which preys on people with pre-existing conditions, and it just showcased the problems with our healthcare system. And yes, I know some people who are listening to this may say, oh, but your health is a matter of personal responsibility. And it is that. But when you see how big the disparities are, it's hard to take someone who has had very little access to healthcare and blame them for their pre-existing conditions. I mean, that's a philosophy that you have to wrestle with a little bit. So then you had these incredibly overwhelmed hospitals in the pandemic. Well, they were all mostly in very disadvantaged neighborhoods. And that's part of the reason why, was the lack of access to resources that led people in those areas to suffer from the pre-existing conditions that made COVID worse, also left them unable to access care when the pandemic hit. So we have this mess in our healthcare system that I think nobody is really willing to grapple with. And I think the 2 big questions are, how much do you want capitalism to dictate who gets access to healthcare and who doesn't? And then if you do want capitalism to dictate who gets access to healthcare and who doesn't, how do you set up a system that rewards the right things? Because the one we have does not. And unfortunately, I'd love to believe that we were going to tackle this. I think we won't until there's really a crisis that renders it all dysfunctional.
Yeah, because, we began the pandemic by reinforcing our love for the first responders, for the nurses, for the doctors. Many of us remember those first couple of months. Now we sit here years later. We continue to see headlines about nursing shortages and the toll that the pandemic, along with everything else, has taken on our medical establishment. Have we seen any changes, any moves for reform, any action, even at a state and local level, if not congressional level, when it comes to shoring up our healthcare industry, especially in light of the fact that we know that more pandemics will happen in the future. It's inevitable given the state of the world.
You would wish that we would have seen more concerted action. Nurses unions for sure have gotten a lot more aggressive, and I do think that the renewed power of unions is a positive. But I don't think there is any concerted action on a national level to say, wait, what do we do here? And part of this comes back to this issue that we're just not willing to confront about how much of our system do we want to be dictated by the mores of capitalism. And so labor is one of the biggest costs at a hospital. I think it's the biggest cost. And so the game in the years leading up to the pandemic was to reduce nursing as much as you could, have nurses only come in when they're needed, engage in on-call staffing in order to maximize profit margins. So then you have a demoralized workforce even before the pandemic hits. Sort of analogous to our supply chains. Everything was running at maximum efficiency, and then when there's a problem, you discover there's not any resilience. Supply chains had been pushed to the point where they snapped. People had been pushed to the point where they snapped.
When you're running things at bare bones, it takes one small thing, in this case, one big thing, to break it. And then we saw that issue for years. Something you dive into in the book is the supply chain and the lessons of globalization for what took place during the pandemic. You do mention a recent book by Rana Foroohar. We had her on the podcast recently, looking at, okay, in light of now what we've learned about globalization, what is the new path here? The lessons from even the last couple of years, the Trump administration, where, regardless of the rhetoric, ultimately the larger message is we do need to hit the reset button of sorts on globalization. What of globalization, where it brought us down, and the lessons coming out of that?
So I have a little bit of a more nuanced view. I think it's really tempting to always want to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater and say globalization bad. We need to end globalization. I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that simple. I do think that we were very thoughtless about how things would work in the event of a disruption. Everything from semiconductor chips to masks. What happens if you've outsourced all of your manufacturing? Can you get it back on a dime? Well, no, as it turns out, you can't. Even with something relatively simple like a mask, you can't get it back in time. When it comes to semiconductor chips and the way the U.S. has lost its manufacturing capacity, wow, can you really not get it back on a dime? And I think I think people are trying to be more thoughtful about that. At the very same time, though, there's been a lot of good to globalization. I don't know. It's an interesting argument. Has it made the world safer? The fact that we know each other and that people may have friends in different countries. I don't know that we want to go back. I don't know that we want to go back to a world of rabid nationalism either. And I think we may miss some of the aspects of globalization where the pendulum to swing to the other extreme. So I'm a little more mixed than some people are on what we do about globalization and how we think through it.
One thing you write early on in the book is lockdowns, how they became the go-to for dealing with the pandemic, and that if we were following the science, it would have been anything but lockdowns. How did, I was interested in kind of how the lockdown thing became so hip, so hot, so quickly. Lay out for the audience how the lockdown idea came about and how effective or ineffective now in retrospect, now that we have a lot of countries and examples to look at, were the lockdowns.
Yeah. So I think everybody lurched to copy China. Western nations lurched to copy China, and we lurched to copy China out of fear because here was this new novel pathogen. Nobody knew what it was going to do and who it was going to affect. And it seemed like, definitely the way to stop any contagious disease is lock everybody in their own box and don't let them out, right?
Right. So China, so just as a reminder, because so much has happened, it feels like in the last 4 years, China goes first, right? The disease shows up there first, and they're like, our strategy in China is lockdowns.
Yeah. And so the West lurched to copy China without any questions really about not only is this the science in quotes, but also can we do in a non-authoritarian government, can we do what China did, even if that is the right strategy? And I would argue the answer to both those things is no. That's it. I don't the initial lockdowns, of course, right? Keeping kids home from school at first while everybody figures out what this thing does. But then I think very quickly, especially as Trump began pushing in some ways to reopen the economy. And what I think the true hallmark of Trump's failure as a leader was that he pushed to reopen the economy and reopen the country, while other people in his administration, namely Deborah Birx and Dr. Fauci, were running around saying, don't do this. So he wanted to have it both ways instead of being a leader and just standing up and saying, this is what we're doing. And anyway, that's my Trump comment, my anti-Trump comment. But I think because Trump was saying it, it became the good progressive thing to do, to say he must be wrong. And as soon as Trump said kids need to be back in school, if you were a good progressive, a good human being, you said, no, we can't send kids back to school, just as a hallmark of your antipathy and your resistance to Trump. And that's how I think what was not a bad idea at the start of the pandemic became ingrained into these years of school closures and stay-at-home mandates that I think were not healthy for a lot of people in society. And at least if you look at the record of Sweden after the pandemic and some of the studies showing that it didn't really matter. Or if you look at the different statistics between Florida and California, and man, there are so many ways to cut these numbers. And that's another thing that gets really complicated here, is basically you can find statistics to support whatever you want to believe in. But the best measures show that adjusted for age, Florida's death rate was really no worse than California's, with very different
right
policies.
California going full lockdown, DeSantis saying pretty quickly on, I'm anti-lockdown, and it's so interesting what you say, because ultimately here, even if what Trump was saying, and I think it was as early as May of 2020, like, let's get things to open up again, that depending on your view of Trump, that basically split your view, regardless of whether he was telling you something that was totally logical, based on science, etc. If you didn't like the man, you were zagging if he's zigging.
So I was on Twitter at the start of the pandemic, and I was pretty outspoken about my views of who was paying the price for this, and pretty outspoken that I thought we needed to get kids back into school, particularly the underprivileged kids who were bearing the weight of this the most. And somebody a close friend's husband DM'd me on Twitter and said, I didn't know you voted for Trump. And I was like, wow. I mean, since when did my views on the necessity of educating children and the unfairness of this to less privileged children become any comment on who I voted for? But that's how it shook out.
Yeah, and that's still how I think people feel to this day, right? They're still standing by whatever, regardless, and in many cases, despite the science, you felt that day, you still feel this way. And education, as you mentioned, is one of the areas we're still seeing the impact, and potentially, sadly, for years to come, the impact here in terms of math scores, writing scores, reading scores, etc. You note in the book that the data showed pretty early on in 2020 that it was safe to have in-person school, and yet, we've talked about criticism of Trump. Let's talk about the blue states here. Blue states that pride themselves on follow the science, follow the data, did not follow the data when it came to in-person schools.
So I think there are two issues here. I think one legitimate and one not as legitimate. And the not so legitimate one is that I think it was a reaction to Trump, and it was the power of teachers unions in states like this to say we're not doing this because Trump says we can do it because we're teachers unions and we have the power to keep things shut down. I think the more legitimate part of it was that teachers, like nurses, were burnt out even before the pandemic hit. They were another group that we had pushed right up to the breaking point. And so then the pandemic hits, and people who had felt like they had been taken advantage of for a long time suddenly are being asked to arguably make themselves unsafe. And even if there were a way to show people that no, actually, it's not really, it's the rate of spread in schools is actually less than in communities. It's tough to take a workforce that has felt marginalized for a long time and then tell them, yeah, put yourself out there once again. And so on that note, I have an enormous amount of sympathy for teachers. It was not easy. What I don't like is that our public health officials were so unclear about it. They didn't say healthy children are at really low risk from this disease, and they said your children might die from COVID. And they didn't. Those studies showing that transmission rates were or less in schools and in the surrounding communities. It became no, schools, because influenza, schools are super spreader places, then that must be true in the pandemic. And kids, those evil snot-nosed, nasty kids, we can't be around them without, again, looking at the data. It's follow the science versus follow the science, right?
And it's done a lot of harm. I mean, we talk about distrust in society for major institutions, going back to our national security institutions, the FBI's and the CIA's coming out of this, the CDC's and the FDA's, the Supreme Court. I mean, you could journalists, a whole variety of categories, and basically people have lost faith in all of them. And what I find, really remarkable is that before this pandemic, when you looked at the numbers, there was still a lot of faith in our medical institutions, in doctors, in the CDC and the FDA, and they lost a lot when it comes to this pandemic. And you just mentioned, they were fear-mongering of sorts, or being unclear. What did you discover in your reporting on this about what was happening in Atlanta at the CDC and the FDA, and why everything turned out to be so wishy-washy? And even to this day, it feels like we still don't have conclusive information coming from them.
Yeah, well, it's another way to measure what you said, the sort of lack of progress post the pandemic, or the unwillingness to look back, because there is this study that shows that the major, the biggest factor in allowing a society to cope with something like a pandemic is the trust a society has in its institutions. And so the fact that we had some decay of trust heading into the pandemic, and then we've doubled down on that, is really frightening, because that does leave us really ill prepared for the next pandemic, or the next big thing that happens, given that trust in institutions has been so broken down. To answer your question more directly, part of it is political. A lot of these institutions had become politicized. The CDC had a big failure early on when it took responsibility for making a test that would determine whether or not people had COVID, and completely botched it and left us behind other countries when it came to testing. But then there's been really muddled communication, and I think part of that is it's an issue that leaders, I think, have to come to grips with, is that in a world that is awash in information, where people can find their own information, oversimplifying for people may feel appealing because, hey, we're all too dumb to get it, so you have to oversimplify in order to cram it down people's throats. But wait, if you don't tell people the truth, they can figure it out, and then they don't believe you. And so it's a really dangerous strategy in a modern world that's awash in information. And I think while you can see it really clearly in the distrust around vaccines. And while some of that was built in before this vaccine was even produced, in terms of vaccine hesitancy that has existed in this country for a long time, but some of it was exacerbated by public health officials, because when the vaccine was approved, we had this miraculous thing. But instead of saying, okay, we've got this semi-miraculous thing, it's probably going to stop you from getting COVID. It's almost certainly going to stop you from needing to be hospitalized or from dying. But by the way, it may not stop you from getting a mild case of COVID. And by the way, we don't know what it does in terms of transmission. We don't know that it protects you against transmission. Then when it turned out that you could still get COVID when you'd been vaccinated, and that you could still transmit if you'd gotten vaccinated, then it wouldn't feel like a lie. It would have felt like, oh, okay, this thing is still miraculous. It prevents you from hospitalization and death. How great. And so I think public health officials undermined the very thing they were trying to support by wishful thinking, overstatement.
What you say is, if they'd just been real here, that in many cases the Biden administration sowed distrust in the vaccine by overselling what the vaccine could do. Many of us remember those spring, summer of 2020 when, literally you had vaccine cards. You're like, well, you're going to give it to me because you don't have the vaccine, when it turns out that we could all both get COVID and transfer COVID, whether we had the vaccine or not. And right. I bet if we did surveys today, I imagine they've been done by the Gallups of the world, et cetera. People probably still have misconceptions about what was promised by the vaccine and what was not. And again, a lot of blame is put on the right for sowing distrust. But what you say is the overselling of the vaccines did as much, maybe more, to sow the distrust in the vaccine because it didn't meet expectations.
Absolutely. And thank you for summarizing. I think you said it better than I did. But the other thing that's interesting is that it's also another example of our politicization. Why can I not say that word? But, when the vaccines were being worked on, they were the Trump vaccines. And it was Democrats who were saying, I'm not taking this unless it's independently validated. And I don't trust a vaccine that's coming out of the Trump administration. And then because it actually didn't get approved by the FDA in time for the election, and they were the great efficacy was announced after the election, they became the Biden vaccines. And so then we flipped, and people who had previously not wanted to take the vaccines because they were the Trump vaccines love the vaccines because they were the Biden vaccines. I mean, the whole thing is just insane.
Yeah, and it's credible because the success of Warp Speed, right, developing the vaccine so quickly was so remarkable, and then it, so quickly devolves into everything else that we discovered during COVID, which is politics. One area I know you're an expert in, and I wanted to get to, is the financial response. The major actions by the Fed, by the government in preventing an economic collapse here, trying to learn the lessons from the 2008 financial collapse, yet blamed today for bringing about the inflation of the last couple of years. So take us back to the decision-making around the Fed, around the financial response, the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how we responded financially to the pandemic.
So I think the good is that the Fed came in guns blazing and without question saved our financial system from what probably would have been collapse and saved our economy too. The bad is that some of the tools were less effective than they could have been because of decades of a Fed policy of super low interest rates, even when it probably would have been financially smart to start raising interest rates. But the Fed in some ways has become captive to the market. And as soon as the Fed starts to raise interest rates, the market starts to howl. And so then the Fed is put in this bind. I think that's part of the bad of it. I think the bad of it is that in the wake of the financial crisis, there were a lot of complaints about the shadow banking system and how the Fed had to bail out institutions that were actually outside its purview and what that meant for our financial system. The shadow banking system has only gotten many times bigger in the intervening years. You'd think if you had just visited from Mars that after the howls about the shadow banking system in the wake of the financial crisis, well, it must have gone away before the pandemic. But instead, it got many times bigger. And a lot of what the Fed had to bail out in the pandemic were institutions that the Fed isn't supposed to have to bail out. So that it raises questions about the stability and structure of our financial system when the Fed constantly has to come in with bigger and bigger guns blazing and a bigger and bigger bailout. What does that mean if the Fed isn't able to come to the rescue? And then I think the ugly of that is that super low interest rates and the Fed's response enabled the rich to get a lot richer. And the cost of that, which is inflation, hurts the poor, once again exacerbating the very inequality that we say we all care about fixing, and adds to this sense that the deck is stacked against those who are the least well off. And that's just to be clear, because super low interest rates and a response like the Fed's help inflate asset prices, and assets are overwhelmingly owned by the already wealthy, so the poor don't get to benefit from that.
So looking back at it in retrospect, in talking to folks from that world, what was the biggest mistake they made if they, look back at it as a Monday morning quarterback?
I think it was too much, and I don't know that anybody inside the Fed is willing to concede anything, particularly right now when it looks like maybe we're gonna get out of this more unscathed.
Right. They may have figured out how to get us out of this without putting us in a recession.
Right. Yeah. And so we may get out of this more unscathed than I had thought was likely when the book went to press. So my innate cynicism and skepticism may be wrong, but I still think this large issue looms about how responsible do we want the Fed to be for our entire economy, and how responsible do we want the Fed to be for an innately fragile financial system, and what if the next one is too big for the Fed to come to the rescue? I think where the Fed went wrong is that they didn't stop in time. They just kept going and kept this strategy called quantitative easing of buying bonds in order harder to hold interest rates down, and kept going and wouldn't admit to the signs of inflation until it was too late.
The feeling was we'd rather fail by doing too much than not enough.
Yes. And on some level, it's possible to hold two truths in your mind, right? On some level, that's understandable, and you can agree with that. The problem is that the too much benefits a very particular group of people.
The people who can take advantage of all that money being injected into the system and record low rates. You mentioned the term shadow banking. Explain that to the non-finance types out there when you talk about what is shadow banking and what are some sort of practical examples of that?
So basically, it's the entire network of financial institutions that exist, that provide credit and are part of our financial system, but are not regulated banks. And so in the financial crisis, you had a lot of blame ascribed to the shadow banking system, because you had all these mortgage companies that made mortgages that weren't part of the regulated banking system. And in the financial crisis, there was all this talk of we need to fix this. We can't have this huge shadow banking system. But it only got bigger in the intervening years. And one key part of it that everyone will recognize are money market funds. So money market funds, the Fed isn't supposed to have to bail out money market funds. Money market funds sit outside of the regulated financial system. But both in the financial crisis and then in the pandemic, the Fed had to step in to bail out money market funds, because if money market funds break down, the whole system goes to hell. And there were all these fixes that were supposedly put in place in the intervening years, and basically they all backfired. Another part of the shadow banking system, weirdly enough, is that in the years since the financial crisis, a lot of mortgages are now held by these entities known as mortgage REITs, and they're not part of the regulated financial system either. And suddenly, when the pandemic hit, they could no longer finance themselves, and so the Fed also had to bail out mortgage REITs, or once again, the financing mechanism for home ownership would have come to a crashing halt. So it's the way our financial system operates, that a lot of the lubrication for it and a lot of credit is provided by institutions that aren't regulated or aren't regulated by the Federal Reserve. And the argument is always, well, if there's a problem, it will sit in those institutions and it won't affect banks. And banks are what we care about. But the problem is it always affects the banks in the end. It always creeps back into the regulated banking system. And so then the Fed ends up having to bail out the whole shebang.
So you make a point in the book of the failures all around, the failure on the right, the failure on the left. I'm curious in retrospect here, I'll start with Trump, DeSantis, and the right. What is the thing they got most accurate about in their response, and what is the thing they failed at the most? And then we'll get to the left here in a second.
I think Trump was right about getting kids back into school. And I think he was right to point out the economic costs of a shutdown. And the good progressive response to that is, who cares about the economy? These are people's lives. But you know what? The economy is people's lives. If it's the structure of our society. If people can't make a living and feed their families and support themselves, and they feel like all of that is breaking down and they're losing their small businesses, that's people's lives too. And so I think that Trump got right. I think what he got wrong was not being a leader, not standing up in front of people and saying, this is what we're doing, trying to have it both ways by trying to deliver this message to his base, and yet having doctors Birx and Fauci run around doing entirely different things, because he didn't want to take ownership. He didn't want to lead.
Oh, interestingly, and that was the DeSantis criticism of him, that he should have fired Fauci.
Well, if this is what you believe, that you believe society should be open and kids should be back in school, then you shouldn't have had Birx and Fauci out there. Mm-hmm. If you don't believe that and you want their policies, then fine, continue to endorse them, but don't attempt to have it both ways. And that chaos and lack of leadership is what I really fault Trump for. And the backbiting in his administration came home to roost. Nobody trusted each other. Nobody worked together. And that, for sure, it's harder to say, and that led to this, but the fact that warp speed almost didn't happen because of backbiting within the Trump administration, and we detail that in the book, is really shocking. I thought DeSantis got a lot right at the start of the pandemic. I was dismayed to see him becoming politicized himself as he decided to run for president. He became crazier and crazier in essence, and on all the logic that he brought to the pandemic early on. This mainly affects old people. Here's how we're going to protect the elderly in our state. We're going to get kids back into school. Became this total catering to a right-wing base. And I was dismayed to see DeSantis, who I thought was logical at the start of the pandemic, becoming a right-wing fearmonger about the vaccines and a conspiracy monger more than a fearmonger. And I think where the right got it wrong also is just not, we had so little empathy for each other and just not understanding that people were scared. And people needed a leader who not only said, this is what we're going to do, and this is our best take on what's happening based on what we can see right now, but we understand that you're scared, and we understand that this is new and this is really frightening. And you need leaders in these times who can do both, right? Who can communicate with people and understand their fears, but also then be strong and take a course of action.
All right, now for the Cuomo-sexuals, Newsoms, the people who bought T-shirts with Fauci's face on it, the left. How did the left do? What did they get right, and what did they get wrong?
So I think the left got right the fear surrounding this, and I think the left got right this very lovely notion of taking care of each other and being in this together and staying home in order to protect each other. The problem is that a lot of that came from people for whom staying home wasn't a cost, because we could work by Zoom and keep our jobs and keep getting paid and have other people bring us food and man the grocery stores and man the pharmacies, so that we could kind of continue to live life. And I think some people on the left miss the privilege inherent in being able to stay safe at home. And that bothers me, because it's privilege as the left's outcry. And I think in many ways what happened in the pandemic was the ultimate, being able to stay home was the ultimate manifestation of privilege. I think the left also missed and still doesn't want to acknowledge the cost to the very people they pretend to care about the most, which are underprivileged kids, and what it would mean to have schools closed for this long. And I think one really ugly reason people missed it is because it wasn't our kids who were affected, because Gavin Newsom's kids, for instance, were at a private school in California. They could go to school. So it was those kids, other people's kids.
Right, and they had good home internet and computers for each of their children,
right,
and rooms for them to, I mean, the basics that, again, you take for granted, right, if you come from privilege.
Right, or a stay-at-home parent who could afford to be there with the kids, making sure they were actually learning on Zoom. All of this all of this inequality was showcased in the pandemic, and I think the left's failure to acknowledge that when it would have made a difference. You know, a lot of people are beating their chests about it now that it's too late. But the failure to acknowledge that when it could have made a difference, I think is the biggest failing. And then I think just playing into this idea that people who care about the economy are somehow bad people. Because again, if you have your money and you're able to keep your job, you're able to be very high and mighty about the economy. If you need to be able to go out and work in order to support your family or to keep your business running, you don't get to be so high and mighty about the economy. And so that, again, there was a breakdown of empathy on both sides. If the right failed to understand people's very legitimate fears, the left also failed to understand people's very legitimate fears.
Yeah, and there's also a criticism that Biden coming in also felt like, well, he needs to put his package out there, when even at that time in spring of 2021, we'd injected so much money into the economy. There are questions now as to whether that was just throwing fuel onto the inflation fire.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo. Yes. And again, that we can't let this be Trump's rescue of the economy. We have to add our own rescue of the economy. And there's no question that contributed to inflation. And there still is a question mark about how much of inflation has taken a huge bite. Inflation isn't created equal either. For people for people for whom groceries and gas and rent don't make up a huge chunk of their monthly nut, inflation may not feel like that big a deal. For people for whom those categories are huge, inflation is a huge deal. Mm-hmm. So once again, it's just another manifestation of this idea that everything seems to hit those who are least able to afford it.
So as far as what's next here, the last time I really remember a bipartisan commission is the 9/11 commission. which is, 20 years ago now, incredibly.
God, isn't that amazing?
And so whether it's January 6th, the two sides couldn't get together. With COVID, the two sides can't get together. I'm not sure whether it's possible in this day and age in the United States of America to have a bipartisan Democratic-Republican commission to look back at an issue, especially as complex as COVID. Short of that, what potentially needs to happen here as you talk to folks across industries to, again, assess, and maybe we need another decade before we look back at this? Who knows how long it'll take or where our politics will be at that point. But what is the solution here to ensure we actually learn some lessons and can fix some things in preparation for the next one of these?
I wish I were more optimistic than I am. I just have become, as I said at the start of this, a little bit cynical about our willingness and ability to learn any lessons. I wish leaders would think as much about resilience, business leaders would think as much about resilience as they do about quarterly profits. What leads to profit maximization, what might really throw a wrench into everything if it goes wrong, and how much do we want to trade off a push toward profit maximization for the lack of resilience? I wish executives would think about that. I wish there would be more. Just as we all talked a big game about rewarding doctors and nurses and frontline workers, so did executives during the pandemic about the people who are on the front lines, and that hasn't really held up in terms of better treatment of workers. So that's a big thing. I wish we'd look at our healthcare system. I wish we'd really look at it. I actually wish we would just burn it all to the ground and start from scratch. I think that's the only way to do it. But there are just too many. There are too many vested interests in healthcare. There are too many people making money off the system as it is for that to happen. And I think that's a huge issue. And I wish we would all have come out of this with more empathy, and instead we came out with less.
Yeah, a huge issue across society, politics, etc. I mean, I guess back to the resiliency point, there have been some examples of some companies exiting China or starting to exit China, the CHIPS Act to start to build some plants here in the U.S. So glimmers, green shoots, as they say in economic speak?
Glimmers for sure. I think it may be a little too late when you look at even the CHIPS Act money going toward reshoring semiconductor manufacturing. It's a fraction of the R&D budget that TSMC, the big Taiwanese company that now basically controls all of semiconductor manufacturing, has. So the idea that the U.S. is going to catch up again, I think, is inherently flawed. That doesn't mean we can't get some critical not critical mass, but some critical elements of it back here. And I'm glad we're at least talking about it. But then again, it's a funny little side note from this is that we all got so mad about the rescue of the banks in the financial crisis, right? Too big to fail. They get to succeed. They get to be capitalist enterprises. And then when a problem comes, the government has to step in. Well, look, hospitals, for-profit hospitals, they got to be capitalist entities, and yet they got bailed out in the pandemic. Semiconductor companies, what else is the CHIPS Act but a bailout of semiconductor companies, Intel in particular? Mm-hmm. And so once again, it's sort of this odd notion of capitalism when times are good for corporate America, but wait, we need taxpayer money as soon as there's a problem. And I don't love that on principle. But yes, at least there are glimmers. We are at least talking about some of these issues. I just don't know. In the end, the push for profit maximization and short-term profit maximization, that is so powerful now and so ingrained that I don't know how much we can change it.
Well, on that note, Bethany, promise a more optimistic conversation next time on your next topic. But
yes, please.
We in the news and journalism don't tend to focus on the good. It's sometimes the conflict and the issues, but hopefully some lessons come out of it. But appreciate your insights here. The book is The Big Fail. You can get it wherever you get your books, and you can continue to read her writing in Vanity Fair.
Thank you so much for having me on.